Sarah Matthews sat alone in her small living room, staring at the clock on her wall. It was 2:47 a.m., and the only sound in her apartment was the soft ticking of that clock and her own shaky breathing. Her hands trembled as she held her phone, trying to press the right numbers. 9 to 11. The young mother's heart was beating so fast she could hear it in her ears. She was only 23 years old, but in that moment, she felt much older. Her dark hair was messy, and her eyes were red from crying. She wore her favorite pink pajamas, now wrinkled and stained with tears. 911, what's your emergency? A calm female voice answered. Sarah's voice cracked as she spoke. My baby, someone took my baby. She could barely get the words out between her sobs. Please, please help me. Emma, my Emma is gone. The dispatcher, Jenny Thompson, immediately sat up straighter in her chair. She had handled many emergency calls in her 8 years on the job. The calls about missing children always made her stomach tight. Ma'am, I need you to take a deep breath. Can you tell me your location? Apartment 204, Pine Valley Apartments, 1520 Cedar Street, Sarah managed to say. She was pacing now, her bare feet making soft sounds on the carpet. I just went to check on her because I heard some strange noises, and... Fresh tears started flowing down her cheeks. When did you last see your baby? Jenny asked, already dispatching police units to the address. Sarah's mind felt foggy as she tried to remember. I put her to bed at 8:30. She was sleeping so peacefully in her purple onesie, the one with little stars on it. Her voice broke again. I checked on her a few times, I always do. But just now, when I went to her room, the window was open and Emma wasn't in her crib. Through the phone, Jenny could hear Sarah moving around her apartment. Officers are on their way, Ms. Matthews. How old is Emma? 6 months, Sarah replied quickly. She just started trying to sit up on her own last week. A sudden wave of dizziness hit her, and she had to lean against the wall to steady herself. The pale blue walls of her hallway seemed to be closing in around her. The sound of sirens in the distance made Sarah run to her window. Through the darkness, she could see the flashing lights getting closer. Her neighbors' lights were starting to turn on too, curious faces appearing in windows. Miss Matthews, please stay on the line with me until the officers arrive, Jenny instructed. Can you tell me what Emma's room looks like right now? Sarah walked back to the nursery, her legs feeling heavy with each step. The window is open, but everything else looks normal. Her blanket is on the floor. She picked up the soft pink blanket, holding it close to her face. It still smelled like baby powder and the lavender lotion she always used after Emma's bath. The room was small but carefully decorated. Pale yellow walls with white clouds painted on them, a white crib with a mobile of colorful butterflies hanging above it, and a rocking chair in the corner where Sarah spent countless nights feeding and singing to Emma. Now it all looked wrong without her baby there. A loud knock at the door made Sarah jump. Police. Ms. Matthews? They're here, she told Jenny, rushing to the front door. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely turn the handle. 2 officers stood in the hallway, their faces serious and professional. Officer Martinez, a tall man with kind eyes, and Officer Chen, a shorter woman with her hair pulled back in a tight bun, quickly introduced themselves. My baby, Sarah said, her voice barely a whisper now. Someone took my Emma. She clutched the pink blanket tighter to her chest as the officers entered her apartment. As Officer Chen began asking her questions, Sarah could see more police cars arriving outside. Red and blue lights flashed through her windows, creating strange shadows on her walls. In her mind, she could still hear Emma's soft baby giggles from earlier that day, and the thought that she might never hear that sound again made her feel like she couldn't breathe. The night that had started so normally had turned into her worst nightmare, and Sarah Matthews had no idea that this was only the beginning of a story that would break the hearts of everyone involved. Officers Martinez and Chen moved through Sarah Matthews' apartment with practiced efficiency. Their flashlights swept across the rooms, creating long shadows on the walls. It was now 3:15 a.m., and the small apartment felt crowded with police presence. Officer Martinez watched as Sarah paced back and forth in Emma's nursery, her bare feet making no sound on the carpet. She hadn't let go of the pink baby blanket since they arrived. Every few minutes, she would press it to her face and breathe in deeply, as if trying to catch her baby's scent. Miss Matthews, Officer Chen said gently, Can you walk us through what happened tonight? She pulled out a small notebook, her pen ready to write. The female officer had handled many missing persons cases in her 5 years on the force, but cases involving babies always felt different. Sarah nodded, but her eyes kept darting to the open window. I put Emma to bed at 8:30, like I always do. She was a little fussy today because she's teething. Her voice cracked on the last word. I gave her the teething ring, sang her favorite lullaby, Twinkle, Twinkle Little Star, and she fell asleep. Officer Martinez moved to examine the window. The screen was still in place, showing no signs of damage. He frowned slightly but kept his face neutral. Something wasn't adding up, but he couldn't quite put his finger on it. Did you check on her during the night? Chen asked, writing in her notebook. Yes, of course. Sarah's voice got louder. I always check on her. At 10, then at midnight. And... She paused, her forehead wrinkled in concentration. Maybe at 1? I'm not sure. Everything's so confusing right now. Outside, more police cars had arrived. Their lights painted the apartment building in alternating red and blue. Neighbors had gathered in the parking lot, whispering among themselves in their pajamas and robes. Some held phones, recording everything they could see. Officer Thompson, the lead forensics investigator, arrived with his team. He was a tall man with gray hair and glasses that kept sliding down his nose. His team immediately began examining the nursery, taking pictures and looking for fingerprints. The window concerns me, Martinez said quietly to Chen. The screen's intact. If someone came through here? Chen nodded, understanding what her partner wasn't saying. She turned back to Sarah, who had sat down in the rocking chair, still clutching the blanket. Ms. Matthews, does anyone else have a key to your apartment? Sarah shook her head. Just me and the building manager, Mr. Peterson, but he's on vacation in Florida. You can check. Her eyes were wide and desperate. Why aren't you out looking for Emma? She's out there somewhere, alone and scared. Just then, Officer Thompson called Martinez over to the window. The two men spoke in hushed tones, their faces serious. Sarah watched them, rocking back and forth in the chair, her knuckles white from gripping the blanket so tightly. More officers were going door to door in the building, asking if anyone had seen or heard anything unusual. The sound of knocking and muffled conversations echoed through the halls. Chen noticed something odd about Sarah's behavior. While she was clearly upset, her reaction seemed off somehow. In her experience, parents of missing children usually couldn't sit still, demanding action, calling family members, or trying to join the search themselves. But Sarah stayed in the rocking chair, her eyes moving between the officers but never fixing on anything for too long. Ms. Matthews, Chen said, is there anyone you'd like us to call? Family? Friends? Emma's father, perhaps. At the mention of Emma's father, Sarah's face changed for just a moment. Something flashed in her eyes. Fear? Guilt? Before disappearing again. No, she said quickly. Emma's father isn't in the picture. And my parents, they live in Oregon. I don't want to worry them yet. Martinez returned from the window, his face carefully blank. Ms. Matthews, we're going to need to take a closer look at the entire apartment. Standard procedure in cases like this. Is that okay? Sarah nodded slowly, but her eyes darted to her bedroom door for just a second. Officer Chen caught the look and made a mental note. In her experience, it was these tiny reactions, these split-second changes in behavior, that often told the real story. Outside, the night was starting to fade into early morning. Birds were beginning to chirp, creating an odd contrast to the tense scene inside apartment 204. None of the officers knew it yet, but this case was about to take a turn that would haunt them for years to come. Detective Lisa Wong arrived at the Pine Valley Apartments just as the sun was starting to rise. She was a small woman in her 40s, wearing a dark blue suit and carrying a worn leather bag. Despite the early hour, her eyes were sharp and alert. This wasn't her first missing baby case, and something about the initial reports had caught her attention. The apartment complex was now fully awake. News vans had started to arrive, their satellite dishes reaching up into the pink morning sky. Officers kept the growing crowd of reporters and curious neighbors behind yellow police tape. Inside apartment 204, Detective Wong found Sarah Matthews sitting at her kitchen table. The young mother's pink pajamas were wrinkled, and her dark hair hung in messy strands around her face. 2 cups of untouched coffee sat on the table, one in front of Sarah, the other in front of Officer Chen, who hadn't left Sarah's side. "Miss Matthews," Detective Wong said softly, sitting down across from Sarah. "I'm Detective Lisa Wong. I know you've already told your story several times, but I need to hear it again. Every tiny detail matters." Sarah lifted her head slowly. The pink baby blanket was still in her lap, her fingers absently playing with its frayed edge. "I've already told the other officers everything," she said, her voice hoarse from crying. "We should be up looking for Emma." Detective Wong pulled out her tablet. "Sometimes, when we tell a story again, we remember new details. Let's start with yesterday morning. Walk me through your entire day with Emma." As Sarah began talking, Detective Wong watched her carefully. She noticed how Sarah's story seemed to flow smoothly when talking about her regular routine, feeding Emma, changing diapers, nap time. But whenever she got to the events right before the supposed abduction, her words became less certain, filled with maybe and I think. In another room, forensics officers were carefully examining Sarah's phone and laptop. Officer Thompson approached Detective Wong and quietly handed her a note. As she read it, her expression remained neutral, but her eyes narrowed slightly. "Miss Matthews," Detective Wong said, interrupting Sarah's story about Emma's bedtime routine. "Your phone shows several searches from the past week. Searches about postpartum depression, about feeling overwhelmed as a single mother, about wanting to escape motherhood. Can you tell me about those?" Sarah's face went pale. The pink blanket slipped from her fingers and fell to the floor. Officer Chen, still sitting nearby, noticed how Sarah's hands began to shake. That's not. Everyone gets overwhelmed sometimes," Sarah stammered. Her eyes darted to the apartment door, then back to Detective Wong. "It doesn't mean anything. I love Emma. I would never hurt her." Detective Wong's voice remained gentle. "No one is saying you hurt Emma. We need to understand everything to find her. Your text messages to Emma's father, Jason, show you've been struggling. Last week, you told him you couldn't do this anymore." Tears started rolling down Sarah's cheeks again, but Detective Wong noticed something different about these tears. They seemed more real than the ones from earlier, as if Sarah was finally letting genuine emotions show through. Outside the apartment, a K9 unit had arrived. The German Shepherd, Max, was sniffing around the building's perimeter with his handler, Officer Roberts. They paid special attention to the garden area behind the building, where the morning dew still clung to the plants. Back in the kitchen, Sarah's carefully constructed story was beginning to fall apart. When Detective Wong asked about the exact time she discovered Emma missing, Sarah gave a different answer than she'd given the first officers. When questioned about the window screen, she couldn't explain how an intruder could have removed and replaced it without damage. "Sometimes, Sarah," Detective Wong said, leaning forward slightly, "young mothers feel trapped. Sometimes the pressure becomes too much. Sometimes they convince themselves that one desperate action might solve everything." Sarah's eyes widened. She opened her mouth to speak, then closed it again. Her hands clutched the edge of the table so hard her knuckles turned white. Just then, Officer Roberts burst through the apartment door, his face urgent. "Detective Wong, Max found something in the garden. You need to see this. Now." The morning sun was now fully up, casting long shadows through the apartment windows. As Detective Wong stood to follow Officer Roberts, she saw something change in Sarah's face, a mix of relief and terror that told her they were finally getting close to the truth. The forensics team worked quickly in the morning light, taking pictures of the garden area behind the apartment building. Officer Roberts kept his German Shepherd, Max, nearby. The dog's behavior had changed dramatically when they reached a specific spot behind a row of thick bushes. Inside the apartment, Detective Wong watched as Sarah Matthews grew more anxious. The young mother couldn't sit still anymore, moving from her kitchen chair to the window, then back again. Her bare feet left damp marks on the floor from the morning dew. She had stepped outside earlier, though she denied doing so. "Sarah," Detective Wong said, spreading some papers on the kitchen table. "We found some interesting things. Would you like to know what they are?" Her voice was kind but firm, like a teacher speaking to a troubled student. Sarah wrapped her arms around herself, shaking her head. The pink baby blanket lay forgotten on the floor where she had dropped it earlier. She looked smaller somehow, younger than her 23 years. The security cameras from the grocery store across the street show no one entering or leaving your apartment building between midnight and 3 a.m., Detective Wong continued. She placed several printed photos on the table, but they did catch something interesting at 2:15 a.m. This is you, Sarah, leaving through the back door. The photos showed a figure in pink pajamas hurrying across the parking lot, carrying something wrapped in blankets. Sarah's face crumpled when she saw them. Officer Chen, who had stayed close to Sarah throughout the morning, noticed fresh soil on the young mother's pink pajama pants. It matched the dirt from the garden area where Max had shown such interest. Your internet history tells a story too, Detective Wong said softly, turning her tablet screen toward Sarah. 2 days ago, you searched how to give up a baby safely and what happens to babies left at hospitals. Yesterday, you looked up, will they know if I leave my baby somewhere safe? Sarah's legs gave out, and she sank to the kitchen floor. Officer Chen knelt beside her, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. Through the window, they could hear the buzz of news helicopters arriving above the apartment complex. Last week, Detective Wong continued, reading from her notes. You sent these text messages to Emma's father. I can't sleep. I can't eat. I can't do this anymore. She cries all the time. I don't know what to do. I'm not cut out to be a mother. Tears rolled down Sarah's cheeks, but these were different from her earlier crying. These tears came with quiet sobs that shook her whole body. They were real tears, not the forced ones from when she first called 911. Outside, the forensics team had set up a small tent over the area Max had identified. Detective Wong's phone buzzed with a message from Officer Roberts. She read it quickly, her face showing no reaction, but her eyes softened as she looked at Sarah. Your neighbor in apartment 103 heard something else, Detective Wong said. She was up late feeding her own baby. At 2:20 a.m., she heard singing coming from the garden area. Someone was singing Twinkle, Twinkle Little Star. Sarah's hands flew to her mouth, trying to hold back a sob. Officer Chen kept her hand on the young mother's shoulder, offering silent support. Sarah, Detective Wong said, kneeling down to meet Sarah's eyes, we know Emma is in the garden. The question is she okay? Every minute matters now. You need to tell us exactly where she is and when you put her there. The morning sun streamed through the kitchen window, creating a warm patch of light on the floor between them. In the distance, church bells began to ring, marking the 6 o'clock hour. Sarah Matthews looked up at Detective Wong, her face showing a mix of fear and relief. I didn't want to hurt her, Sarah whispered, her voice breaking. I just needed it to stop. I thought if someone found her, they could give her a better life than I could. I made sure she was warm. I wrapped her in so many blankets. Detective Wong was already reaching for her radio, but she kept her eyes on Sarah. The next few minutes would determine everything, and somewhere in the garden, time was running out for baby Emma. The morning sun had fully risen over Pine Valley Apartments, casting long shadows through the kitchen windows. Sarah Matthews sat on the floor, her pink pajamas dirty with garden soil as the carefully built wall around her lies began to crumble. Detective Wong sat cross-legged on the floor across from her, close enough to show support, but far enough to give Sarah space. Officer Chen remained nearby, her hands still resting supportively on Sarah's shoulder. The room was quiet except for the distant sound of helicopter blades and the murmur of the growing crowd outside. Start from the beginning, Detective Wong said gently. Not the story you told before, the real story. Sarah's hands twisted in her lap, her fingers raw from hours of anxious pulling. Emma wouldn't stop crying, she whispered. Not just last night. For weeks. Nothing I did helped. Her voice cracked with emotion. Everyone said it would get easier, that I'd know what to do. But I didn't. I never knew what to do. Through the open window came the sound of birds singing their morning songs, a strange contrast to the tense scene inside. In the garden, forensics teams worked carefully, following Max the police dog's signals. The crying got worse this week because of her teething. Sarah continued, her words coming faster now. I couldn't sleep. Couldn't think straight. Yesterday, I called Emma's father, begging him to help. She wiped her eyes with shaking hands. He said he had a new family now. Said I needed to grow up and handle it myself. Detective Wong nodded encouragingly while making notes on her tablet. She noticed how Sarah's posture had changed. no longer performing grief, but showing real pain. Last night, after putting Emma to bed, I sat in my room looking up ways to give her up. Sarah's voice dropped even lower. I read about safe haven laws, about leaving babies at hospitals or fire stations. But everyone would know. Everyone would judge me. I just wanted her to be safe and taken care of, but I couldn't face the shame. A police radio crackled somewhere in the apartment. Sarah jumped at the sound, then continued speaking, as if the words were rushing out on their own now. Around 2 this morning, Emma started crying again. I went to her room, picked her up, and just walked. Back and forth, singing her favorite lullaby. Sarah's hands moved as if she were still holding her baby. Then I had this idea: if someone took her, no one would blame me. They'd feel sorry for me instead. Officer Chen felt Sarah trembling under her hand. Outside, more news vans were arriving, their satellite dishes reaching toward the sky like metal trees. I wrapped her in so many blankets, Sarah said, her voice breaking. 5 blankets. Made sure she was warm. I took her through the back door, to the garden. There's this spot behind the bushes where I sometimes sit to cry. She looked up at Detective Wong with tear-filled eyes. I made a soft bed with leaves and more blankets. I thought someone would find her quickly, that she'd cry and someone would hear. Detective Wong leaned forward. And then? I came back inside, waited half an hour, messed up her room a little, opened the window. Sarah's words were coming between sobs now. Then I called 911. I thought I was doing the right thing, that someone would find her and give her a better life than I could. Sarah, Detective Wong said urgently, already reaching for her radio, exactly where in the garden is Emma? It's been almost 4 hours now. Sarah's eyes widened with sudden horror, as if she was only now realizing how long it had been. Behind the big azalea bushes, she gasped. There's a small clearing. Please hurry. Will she be okay? Detective Wong was already on her feet, speaking rapidly into her radio. Officer Chen helped Sarah stand, but kept a firm grip on her arm. Through the window, they could see officers running toward the garden area, their movements urgent but careful. The morning had grown warmer, and somewhere in that garden, wrapped in 5 blankets, time was running out for baby Emma. The next few minutes would reveal whether Sarah's desperate plan had become something much more tragic. The garden behind Pine Valley Apartments exploded with activity. Officers moved quickly but carefully through the morning dew-covered grass, following Max the police dog's excited signals. Detective Wong led the way, with Officer Roberts and his dog right beside her. The azalea bushes Sarah had mentioned were large and thick, creating a natural hidden area behind them. As they approached, Detective Wong could see why someone might choose this spot to hide. It was almost invisible from the apartment windows above. Here, Officer Roberts said, holding back a branch. Max keeps focusing on this spot. Detective Wong's heart beat faster as she moved forward. 20 years on the force hadn't made moments like these any easier. The morning sun hadn't yet reached this shaded area, making it harder to see clearly. Then they heard it. A tiny sound, somewhere between a whimper and a sigh. Get the medical team. Now. Detective Wong called out, her usual calm voice rising with urgency. She pushed through the branches, ignoring the scratches on her arms. There, in a small clearing, was a carefully made nest of blankets. Detective Wong dropped to her knees beside it, her hands shaking slightly as she pulled back the layers. First a blue blanket, then a yellow one, a green one, another blue one, and finally, the soft pink one they'd seen Sarah holding earlier. Inside this cocoon of blankets lay baby Emma. Oh my God, Officer Roberts whispered. Is she? Emma's tiny face was pale, her lips slightly blue from the cold. But then, movement. Her small chest rose and fell with shallow breaths. As Detective Wong gently touched her cheek, Emma's eyes fluttered open. She's alive. Detective Wong shouted. Get the paramedics in here now. The medical team was already pushing through the bushes, carrying their equipment. Sarah, still in the custody of Officer Chen, watched from her kitchen window above, her hands pressed against the glass. Emma started to cry, a weak sound at first, then growing stronger. The paramedics worked quickly, checking her temperature, her breathing, her responses. Detective Wong stood back, watching as they wrap the baby in special warming blankets. Her temperature is low, but not dangerously so, one paramedic said. Those 5 blankets probably saved her life, and the leaves underneath created insulation from the cold ground. Officer Martinez, one of the first responders from earlier that night, had to turn away for a moment. In his 10 years as a police officer, he'd seen many things, but the sight of this tiny baby, alive against all odds, brought tears to his eyes. She's stable, the lead paramedic announced. We need to get her to the hospital for observation, but she's going to be okay. A collective sigh of relief passed through the group of officers. Above them, they could hear cheers from the crowd of onlookers who had gathered at the police tape, though they couldn't see what was happening behind the bushes. As they carefully carried Emma out of the garden, Detective Wong noticed something that made her pause. The way the blankets had been arranged, the careful nest of soft leaves underneath. This hadn't been done by someone who wanted to hurt a baby. This was the act of a desperate mother who, even in her darkest moment, had tried to protect her child. In the apartment above, Sarah collapsed into Officer Chen's arms, sobbing as she watched her baby being carried to the waiting ambulance. Her tears now were different, relief mixed with shame, fear mixed with gratitude. Detective Wong took one last look at the nest of blankets before the forensics team moved in to document everything. The morning sun had finally reached this spot, illuminating something she hadn't noticed before. Written in small letters on the corner of the pink blanket was a message. Please love her better than I could. The ambulance sirens started up, but this time they weren't rushing to an emergency. They were carefully transporting a miracle baby who had survived the night, wrapped in 5 blankets and her mother's confused love. News helicopters circled overhead, their cameras trying to catch the story, but they couldn't capture what the officers felt in that garden. Sometimes, even the toughest police officers needed a moment to wipe their eyes, especially when a story that could have ended in tragedy instead became one of hope. Pine Valley Hospital buzzed with activity as baby Emma received care in the pediatric unit. The small room was filled with the gentle beeping of monitors and the soft whoosh of a heating unit keeping her warm. A kind-faced nurse named Maria checked on her every 15 minutes, smiling each time she found the baby's color improving. Down the hall, in a different section of the hospital, Sarah Matthews sat in a small office with Dr. Rebecca Chen, a psychiatrist specializing in postpartum depression. Detective Wong had made sure Sarah was brought here instead of the police station, understanding that this was a case needing medical help more than legal punishment. When did you first notice these feelings? Dr. Chen asked gently, watching as Sarah twisted a tissue in her hands. Sarah wore hospital scrubs now, her soil-stained pink pajamas taken as evidence. Right after Emma was born, Sarah whispered, looking down at her hands. Everyone said I would feel this instant love, this amazing connection, but I felt nothing. Just tired and scared. Her voice shook with emotion. I kept waiting for the love to come, for the mother instincts to kick in, but they never did. Outside the office window, the morning had turned into afternoon. News vans still crowded the hospital parking lot, their reporters waiting for updates on the story that had captured the city's attention. Did you tell anyone how you were feeling? Dr. Chen asked, making notes on her tablet. Sarah shook her head. I was ashamed. The nurses at my checkups asked if I was okay, but I just smiled and said yes. My mom offered to come help, but she wiped her eyes. I wanted to prove I could do it on my own. Everyone on social media makes motherhood look so easy. In the waiting room down the hall, Detective Wong sat talking with Sarah's parents, who had caught the first flight from Oregon after hearing the news. Her mother, Linda, couldn't stop crying, blaming herself for not seeing the signs. Her father, Tom, sat quietly, his face showing the shock of it all. Your daughter needs support right now, not judgment, Detective Wong told them. The hospital has an excellent mental health team. They're evaluating her for severe postpartum depression. Back in Dr. Chen's office, Sarah was finally letting out all the feelings she'd kept hidden for months. Sometimes I couldn't even get out of bed to make Emma's bottle. I'd lie there, listening to her cry, hating myself for not being able to move. She looked up at Dr. Chen with tear-filled eyes. Does that make me a monster? No, Sarah, Dr. Chen said firmly. It makes you someone who was suffering from a serious medical condition without help. Postpartum depression is real, and it's not your fault. A social worker named James Parker joined them, carrying a folder of resources. He explained to Sarah that she wouldn't be facing criminal charges. Instead, she would be entering an intensive treatment program specializing in postpartum mental health. Emma will stay with your parents temporarily, James explained kindly. Once you're stable and your treatment team agrees, we'll start supervised visits. This isn't the end of your story with Emma. It's the beginning of your recovery. Sarah's shoulders relaxed slightly, the first time she'd shown any relief all day. Can I see her before my parents take her? Dr. Chen nodded, standing up. Let's go check with her doctors. She's doing very well, thanks to how carefully you wrapped her up. She touched Sarah's shoulder gently. Even in your darkest moment, a part of you was still trying to protect her. As they walked down the hospital hallway, they passed a wall of windows. The afternoon sun streamed through, warming Sarah's face. For the first time since this nightmare began, she felt something new. Hope. Detective Wong watched them pass by, thinking about how this case would change things. Already, the hospital was discussing better screening programs for new mothers. Local news stations were preparing special reports on postpartum depression. Something good would come from this near tragedy. In the pediatric unit, baby Emma slept peacefully, her color now completely normal. Nurse Maria adjusted her blanket. Just one now, soft and warm enough for a baby who was safe at last. On the bedside table, she had placed a small sign that the other nurses had made, Emma the Miracle Baby. 6 months had passed since that life-changing night at Pine Valley Apartments. The garden behind the building now had a small playground, built by the community after the story touched so many hearts. The azalea bushes still stood, but now they were surrounded by cheerful flowers and a small bench with a plaque that read, Hope Grows Here. Sarah Matthews sat on that bench, watching as other mothers played with their children on the new swings. She looked different now, healthier, with color in her cheeks and life in her eyes. Her weekly therapy sessions with Dr. Chen had helped her understand and fight her postpartum depression. The intensive treatment program had given her tools to cope with her feelings and rebuild her confidence. Ready for today? A familiar voice asked. Detective Wong, now off-duty and wearing casual clothes, sat down beside Sarah. Over the months, she had become more than just the officer who solved the case. She had become a friend and supporter. Sarah nodded, though her hands twisted nervously in her lap. I think so. Mom's bringing Emma in an hour. Today would be their first unsupervised visit since that night. They had worked up to this moment slowly, with months of supervised visits and careful evaluation by the mental health team. Inside the apartment building, Sarah's unit had changed too. The walls were now painted in bright, cheerful colors. Books about parenting and mental health sat on her shelves, and the refrigerator was covered with pictures from her supervised visits with Emma. Each photo showing more smiles, more connection, more healing. Remember what Dr. Chen said? Detective Wong reminded her gently. You're not the same person you were 6 months ago. You've done the work. You've earned this. Sarah smiled softly, remembering her journey. The treatment center had taught her she wasn't alone. She had met other mothers fighting the same battles, sharing similar stories. Together, they had learned to forgive themselves and focus on getting better for their children. Officer Chen, who had stayed in touch with the case, often brought her own baby to visit Sarah during recovery. She had helped start a support group at the local police station for mothers struggling with postpartum depression. The group met every Tuesday, and Sarah now helped lead the discussions, turning her experience into hope for others. At the hospital where Emma had been treated, Nurse Maria had helped create a new screening program for new mothers. Pictures of Emma's story, with permission, hung in the maternity ward, encouraging mothers to speak up if they needed help. The shame and silence that had trapped Sarah were being replaced by understanding and support. Look who's here early, Detective Wong said softly, pointing toward the parking lot. Sarah's mother Linda was walking toward them, carrying a happy, healthy 1-year-old Emma. The baby had grown so much, her dark hair in tiny pigtails, her face full of smiles. She wore a yellow dress with small butterflies on it, and her eyes lit up when she saw Sarah. Mama, Emma called out, reaching her little arms toward Sarah. It was a sound that once brought anxiety and fear, but now filled Sarah's heart with joy and love. Sarah stood up, her legs shaking slightly as she walked toward them. Linda handed Emma over with tears in her eyes. Happy tears this time, so different from the tears they had all shed 6 months ago. Hi, Sweet girl, Sarah whispered, holding Emma close. The baby smelled of baby powder and sunshine, and her little hands patted Sarah's cheeks with complete trust and love. Detective Wong watched from the bench, thinking about how this case had changed not just one family, but an entire community. The police department now had special training for handling postpartum depression cases. Local hospitals had better support systems in place. Mothers who needed help knew where to find it. As the afternoon sun warmed the playground, Sarah sat on a swing with Emma in her lap, gently rocking back and forth. She sang softly, "Twinkle, twinkle, little star," but this time the lullaby wasn't filled with desperation. Instead, it carried the sweet sound of a mother's healing love. Linda and Detective Wong watched from the bench, sharing knowing smiles. Sometimes the darkest moments led to the brightest changes. Behind them, the azalea bushes swayed in the breeze, their flowers blooming bright and strong, just like the second chance growing between a mother and her miracle baby.